All right, what's going on YouTube? Thanks for tuning back in. And today's video is going to be on how to replace your rotors and brake pads on a Mark IV GTI in the rear of the vehicle. So with that being said, I'm going to show you here in a second what I purchased as far as the name brand goes. I'm going to show you what tools are required to tackle this project. And then last but not least, I'm going to show you from start to finish on how to properly conduct this. So with that being said, let's get to it. Okay, so these are the parts that I'll be installing today. These are the rotors for the rear, and these are the brake pads for the rear. Here's the part number for it. The ones that I went with are the drilled and slotted ones. You will see those later once I install those. If you missed the part number, just check down below in the comment section. I have a link for these. And then last but not least, I went with the STOPTECH street brake pads. All right, so could have went with the track ones, but the car is bone stock, so there's really no need for it. And then here is the part number for that. And then again, if you missed it, just check down below in the comment section, and again, I will have a link posted there. But again, this is what's going on in Mark IV today. So these are the tools at a minimum that are required to tackle this project as far as putting those new rotors and brake pads on there. So again, you can substitute this for manual tools, but either way, I do have some pneumatic tools that I will be using. So I'm using a half impact air wrench. I'm using the 3/8 ratchet, 17 millimeter socket. I got a 13 millimeter deep socket, and then I have another 13 millimeter short or regular socket. They're gonna have the Allen key ones right here. This is a 8 millimeter. You'll see later. Again, later I will specify, and I'm going to tell you actually, or show you in the video when I'm going to be using these. 5 millimeter one and a 4 millimeter one. Then a Phillips screwdriver, 15 millimeter wrench, a wire brush, flat tip screwdriver, some needle nose pliers. Blue Loctite because I did not have new bolts. The majority of bolts that you take apart, it is highly recommended. Even in the Bentley states that you should replace the bolts. I don't have new bolts, so I just put Loctite, and usually I just give them a little bit extra of a turn once I torque them down to spec. Bungee cord, a breaker bar for those stubborn bolts if you run into any of those, a 1/2 inch torque wrench. Again, because every bolt that I put back on there, I torqued them down to spec. Then you'll need some brake and caliper grease, brake parts cleaner, and then last but not least, the brake caliper piston tool set from Schwab that I purchased at ECS Tuning. The only reason I'm saying that is you can't use the generic one. You're gonna have to use these right here, just due to the fact when you do take them off, you see here later in the video, when you try to push in the actual piston of the caliber, it has to rotate and be pushed at this same time, so simultaneously. So you can't just get the generic one where you kind of just ratchet down on it and then it pushes the piston back in. So again, before you start, either purchase yourself one of these kits, or before I purchased this one, I think I went to AutoZone. I think it was like $120. But as you already know, once you go to AutoZone, rent a tool, as long as you bring it back within that time limit, you get that money back. But again, these are the tools that are going to be required to tackle this project. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is you're going to remove the wheel. Since I have pneumatic tools, I can do it while it's jacked up. But if you don't have pneumatic tools, just make sure the vehicle is on the ground, loosen up the lug bolts, then raise it, and then take the wheel completely off. Okay, so the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take those needle nose pliers and you're going to feed that cable through that actual little bracket on the left hand side and the caliber. Once you pull it out, you can just let it hang there. Now with a 15 millimeter wrench and a 13 meter socket, we're going to remove the bolts from the brake caliber housing while counter holding the guide pins. So since I missed this part, this should have been like the second step after taking off the brake cable. There's a retaining clip right there. Just take a flat tip screwdriver, small one, pop that out, and then feed that brake cable through that little hole right there. Now once you have taken that off, just take the bungee cords and just strap up the brake caliper so it's not just hanging loose and tearing up the brake lines. Once the brake caliper is put to the side, you can take the brake pads off. Next, you're going to take your 8mm socket and loosen those two bolts off to take off the brake carrier. So now with that 4mm Allen key socket, you're going to take that screw off, and that's going to enable you to take the rotor off. Next, you're going to take the rotor and you're going to put that on the wheel hub, and then you're going to take your screw, depending if it's Phillips or it's an Allen key. I think mine were Allen key, and I had to use a 4mm Allen key socket to tighten that down. It specifies in the Bentley manual that it has to be 35 inch per pound, but all I usually do with these is just a nice hand tight. Next, it's going to be a little bit all over the place, so I apologize. But once I removed the guide pins, I cleaned the brake carrier and the brake caliper thoroughly. Once that was clean, I took the guide pins, put some more grease on it, and reinserted those back into the brake carrier. Next, I took a wire brush and I cleaned off the rust and whatever debris were on the two bolts that hold the brake carrier in place. Once I did that, I used some blue Loctite, just like with the other bolts. Applied a small amount on the actual bolt, and then tightened the two bolts that hold the carrier pin in place at 48 foot-pounds. Once that was done, I took the grease and applied it on the respective grease points as the Bentley manual states. Next, I took a wire brush and I cleaned off the retaining springs that go into the brake carrier. Once those were cleaned off, I also applied a small amount of grease on there just to ensure once the brake pad's on there, I don't get any kind of squeaking noise. Next, I took both brake pads and installed them into the brake carrier. Next, you're going to have to take the brake caliper tool set, and then you're going to have to push that piston in all the way to actually get that brake caliper over those two brake pads. Now once the tool is in place, I had to take a 22mm wrench to hold it in place, and then keep screwing it until that piston was all the way back in the home position. So once the brake piston is in the home position as it is right now, there's a couple things that I did. First, I put the brake caliper on the actual brake pads. There's two little springs on each brake pad. Just make sure they're underneath the actual brake caliper. Then I took the bolts that's going to tighten this brake caliper down, and I used a wire brush, clean them off again, just trying to get whatever residue rust is on there. And then I used blue Loctite. And then once I put the blue Loctite on there, it's the same procedure as taking it off. You're going to counter hold the guide pins with the 15mm wrench, and then with a 13mm socket, you're going to torque those bolts down to 26 foot-pounds. So next thing I did, I took some electrical cleaner, cleaned off the ABS sensor. Once I cleaned that, I put it back in the hole and then tightened that bolt down about hand tight. After I did that, I also ensured that I reconnected it so I wouldn't get a warning light in my cluster. Next thing, just in reverse order, you're going to take that brake cable, you're going to feed it through that little hole in that bracket, and then you're going to pull up on the cable and feed it through until it gets into the bracket where it holds it in place. After that, you're going to take the retaining clip and you're going to put it back into place. Now, since I'm running wheel spacers, you can kind of skip this step. Just kind of kept this in the footage because this is where I put my wheels back on. But either way, all you're going to do now is just pretty much put the wheel back on, hand tighten the wheel bolts back into the hub. Then after that, what I usually do is I take a ratchet, just kind of tighten them down a little bit more before I lower the vehicle. And then once the vehicle is lowered, I will torque those wheel bolts to spec.